Hi everyone, so this is the pre-reading video for Mother Tongue. The idea is I just want to say a couple things about it. It shouldn't be too long, so that when you actually go to read it, and that reading is due on Monday, again you can do it anytime you want, but when you go to read it, some things will be clear. So I just want to clear up a couple things in here that sometimes confuse students. There also, by the way, will not be a quiz embedded in this video, but it will just be useful for you to help you understand what's going on with the essay. So the essay is called Mother Tongue. And as some of you may be aware, Mother Tongue is a phrase that we use to talk about the language that somebody grew up with. Right? So if they grew up speaking Spanish, Spanish is their mother tongue. If they grew up speaking Korean, Korean is their mother tongue. So if you speak a couple of different languages, your mother tongue is the one that you grew up speaking. This is also, by the way, about her mother, and so that's a pun, right? She's playing on that word mother because she's saying mother tongue is what we use for the language you grew up with, but this is also her mother's speech that she's going to be talking about here. It's by Amy Tan. Amy Tan is an author. She gained some renown a while back in the 80s for a novel called The Joy Luck Club, which was turned into a movie, made like $1 gazillion. And so she's, among people who read these kinds of books, she's a fairly well-known and accomplished author. So let's go through what she says here in the first paragraph. I'm not a scholar of English or literature. I cannot give you much more than personal opinions on the English language and its variations in this country or others. That is, just take that word scholar. A scholar is going to be somebody who studies things like this professionally. And so if we have professors at the college who specifically focus on English and grammar and things like that, then they're a scholar of that. My wife is a literacy professor, and so that's something that she studies. Or we have professors who study literature, and they are going to be scholars of literature. Some of your professors here might be scholars of literature. I am not a scholar of literature. I am a writer, and I'm like Amy Tan. And so I can talk about writing itself, but I can't necessarily be, again, a scholar of literature. But in any case, she is saying these are my limitations. I'm not going to talk about this in a scholarly way. I'm going to tell you my personal experiences, which is fine. And it's interesting that she's kind of telling us at the beginning that that's what she's going to be doing. So then she says in here, as I already told you, I am a writer. And by that definition, I am someone who has always loved language. I am fascinated by language in daily life. I spend a great deal of my time thinking about the power of language, the way it can evoke an emotion, a visual image, a complex idea, or a simple truth. Language is the tool of my trade, and I use all of them, all the Englishes I grew up with. And I think that's kind of an interesting phrase that she has in there. She's kind of setting this up, putting us on notice that that's some of the things she's going to be talking about, different variations of English. And again, this is something that I talked about in the previous videos when we talked about and I was bringing up the idea of what we're going to be discussing, code switching and the different versions of English. And notice that she kind of puts all these Englishes on the same level. She's saying that they all matter because she's going to be able to use all of them. And so there isn't this sense in which she's saying, well, this is the correct English. So again, remember I was talking about that before in that video. She's kind of following along with that same idea that I was bringing up there, which is why I brought it up, because I knew that this was coming. So I think it's important for us to think about that she is talking about those different varieties of English and putting them all on equal footing here. So then she says, recently I was made keenly aware of the different Englishes I do use. I was giving a talk to a large group of people, the same talk I'd already given to a half-dozen other groups. The nature of the talk was about my writing, my life, and my book, The Joy Luck Club. The talk was going along well enough until I remembered one major difference that made the whole talk sound wrong. My mother was in the room, and it was perhaps the first time she had heard me give a lengthy speech, using the kind of English I have never used with her. I was saying things like the intersection of memory upon imagination, and there's an aspect of my fiction that relates to thus and thus, a speech filled with carefully wrought grammatical phrases, burdened, it suddenly seemed to me, with nominalized forms, past perfect tenses, conditional phrases, all the forms of standard English that I had learned in school and through books, the forms of English I did not use at home with my mother. And so remember in that previous video, I was talking about that idea that we all use different kinds of Englishes in different kinds of situations. I think about this thinking with my mother. My mother would probably never imagine that this is the way that I speak necessarily when I'm in front of a class. I have a different way of speaking, even though on some level I've always spoken something like this. But on another level, there is a way in which I speak rather differently. And so she about this idea that there are these different varieties of English that she is going to be speaking, and she's aware of that. And her mother's not aware that she uses what is seen as more standard, using these nominalized forms. That's where we turn everything into a noun, and it's one of the things that we do when we're trying to be more formal. Certain kinds of tenses, past perfect tenses, conditional phrases, if this were that, or if this had been the case. And these things like that we're going to be using that are not the kinds of language that we use in everyday speech necessarily. And so she's becoming aware of that on some level, aware that she is using these different kinds of English. And then she says, just last week, I was walking down the street with my mother, and I again found myself conscious of the English I was using, the English I do use with her. We were talking about the price of new and used furniture, and I heard myself saying this, not waste money that way. My husband was with us as well, and he didn't notice any switch in my English. And then I realized why. It's because over the 20 years we've been together, I've often used that same kind of English with him, and sometimes he even uses it with me. It has become our language of intimacy, a different sort of English that relates to family talk, the English I grew up with. And so that's interesting. Notice that not waste money that way, right? That's very different from saying something like the intersection of memory upon imagination. Very different kind of language that she's going to be using there. Again, that's, as she says, that becomes the language of intimacy, the language that they use, in a marriage, in a family, right? It's the language that she grew up with. And so that's very different from the English that she might use in a very public kind of a situation. So that's all I want you to kind of keep in mind with that's on some level what she's going to be talking about. I think the rest of this hopefully will become fairly clear afterwards. Again, if you do have questions, you can bring them up. Put them in the Ask Me Anything discussion board, or you can email me. But hopefully just understanding that idea, how this essay relates to some of the things that I was talking about earlier, how it's going to connect to some of the other videos that you need to watch about code switching, because they're all of a piece. There's something about the way in which we're going to be using different kinds of language. In the Key and Peele speech, you'll see them move, Key and Peele sketch, you'll see them moving back and forth between different varieties of English. In some of the other talks that you're going to see, one of the women who's going to be speaking is going to move back and forth between different kinds of speech. She's fluent in a variety of different kinds of English, just as Tan is. And again, if you reflect on it, you realize that you yourself can do the same kind of thing. So I just wanted to make this video for you to keep that in mind, so that hopefully it'll make reading the rest of the essay easier.